Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field. This episode is brought to you by AutoRescueTools.com and Isaac Rodell. If you are looking to get into module programming, but you are not sure what kind of laptop you're going to need or how to set it up for programming, Isaac is your guy. He can set up laptops specifically to do control module programming for specific brands with partitioned hard drives and all the software that you're going to need to do this. He also sells key cutting equipment, scan tools, and other diagnostic equipment. I bought some stuff from him in the past, and the support is phenomenal. So I highly recommend checking out the website. Again, that's AutoRescueTools.com. The link will be in the show notes. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping. I'll be your host once again for this week's episode. Thank you so much for joining me. Today on the show, it's just me, and I've got another case study or a couple case studies here for you. It's a little bit of a theme. This is something that I've ran into, a handful of times, maybe 8 or 9 times over the course of doing mobile. A few more just as a technician. It definitely doesn't happen all of the time, and sometimes it presents itself in a different way. And in that case, I've seen it a lot more. But what it causes is a no start for the vehicle, but the reason of the no start, it's just not the most likely scenario or not the first thing that at least I think of when I hop into a no start vehicle. So I'll just spill the beans here. What I'm talking about is restricted exhaust. Now, like I mentioned, if we're just talking restricted exhaust where it causes a performance issue, right? Most of the time that's low power. I've seen this probably hundreds of times, right? That be catalytic converter or whatever is restricting the exhaust. Usually it is a converter. Even if it's one that broke down and went into the other one, it will cause a situation where you can still start your engine. It'll still run, it'll idle, and maybe even accelerate somewhat. But you either have severely reduced power, maybe you have misfires on one side of the engine, be some symptoms, but you can still actually start the engine and run. Now, you have an exhaust that is so restricted that you can't even start the engine. That's a little bit of a different story. Now, it does happen. You've probably ran into it out there. Maybe you haven't. Maybe you have not seen that, seen vehicles, but when it comes about, it's definitely thrown myself and members of my team for a little bit of a loop before we got there. Now, the reason I'm talking about it is, number one, kind of an interesting reason for an engine to not start. And we can talk about some of the symptoms and the ways that you could catch this, eliminating everything else, which the first time I ran into this was the case. I just eliminated everything else. And I'm like, well, okay, I have to go this route. And it ended up being the restricted exhaust. But we saw it twice in 1 week, which I thought was odd, just again, because it doesn't happen every day where you have a no start from a completely plugged up or restricted exhaust. Okay, so I'll talk about those cars and then a couple other ones over the years so that I can group together some tests, some symptoms, and some things that you can use to kind of catch and say, oh, okay, this is, leading me towards a potential restricted exhaust. Now, of course, some of the symptoms might match up with some other reasons that an engine might be a no start. Again, a lot of times in diagnostics, we're adding up a number of different tests and symptoms to point to one thing. And if you have enough of them that all point to the same thing, okay, let's go, check that out. Now, we can do some of these tests to really help prove that it is in fact the exhaust, but the visual to actually make sure that is the part or that is the component that is keeping the engine from starting, it's a little bit tougher because you have to take apart the exhaust in some form. Now, maybe you live in a state down south where pulling out O2 sensors is not an issue, and hopefully they're easy to get to. For me, that is almost never a realistic possibility. Number one, because I don't always have access to underneath the vehicle easily. Could we get it into a shop and up on a hoist potentially? But then I got to use somebody else's tools to get the O2 sensor out. I don't carry that stuff with me. But I also live in the Rust Belt where there's a lot of salt on the road. And if that vehicle is, I don't know, older than 6-7 years old, there's a real good chance I'm going to need an oxyacetylene torch to get that oxygen sensor out. And when I do, I might damage the threads or the sensor itself in order to get it out. And so you don't want to make it something where you're damaging a sensor just to try to prove it. Now, if you could do that easily, that's one of the simplest things you can do is yank the O2 sensor out and then try to start the vehicle. And if it starts and runs with the O2 sensor out, and you'll hear it, there'll be a lot of pressure coming through that hole, then, that's a really good sign that, hey, okay, we have, a restricted exhaust here. Back in the day, I remember I worked with somebody who he would test for restricted exhaust on a running engine by drilling a small hole in front and behind the catalytic converter, and you could measure the pressure on each side, or you could just listen and feel it, and it would be a pretty obvious sign. Now, I don't know how well that's going to work for you in a no start scenario, and I think we have some better tests for measuring pressure nowadays, but this was a long time ago, and that was how this guy did it. But anyways, pulling that O2 sensor out if possible, and this of course would have to be ahead of the restriction in the exhaust, that would do it. Okay, but again, not a realistic test for me to do in most situations, most of the cars I'm working on. So I have to do some other things to get there. And I have to get to that point, just in general, that I think this is a restricted exhaust. There have to be something pointing me in that direction. Okay. So I'll give you the first vehicle that I was working on here. Just a couple weeks ago was a 2002 Honda Odyssey. And this vehicle had been sitting for a while and it didn't want to start, or it would start just like real briefly and then it would stall out and then it would just crank and maybe pop every once in a while here, but it wouldn't start again. And we went through, and of course we're checking our basics here of, air, fuel, spark. What do we have? What's missing? Where is the problem here? Also, when I say air, looking at the compression of the engine. And there's a couple things here in your initial inspections on a vehicle that might at least add restricted exhaust to the possibilities. One of the things that I notice with these vehicles is, at least after they've been sitting for a period of time, and by period of time, an hour or more, and this also would depend on the ambient temperature that could increase the wait time, but it's enough time for any built up fuel in the cylinders to maybe evaporate so that they're not completely flooded or washed out. And at this point, when you go to start the vehicle, it will actually start briefly and then it will shut off. And this could also lead you towards an anti-theft situation. And I had a Toyota Camry years ago where I thought it was an anti-theft situation because it would kind of do like a start stall thing. I actually had a Ford Explorer years back too that had a similar restricted exhaust. Thought it was an anti-theft thing. But that was the situation where it would kind of start and then it would stall. And what's happening there is, after the vehicle's been sitting for a while, the fuel's dried up in the cylinders, you go to start it and you have everything you need immediately, right? You have fresh air coming into the engine, you've got spark, you've got fuel spraying, you've got the correct compression, and for a very brief period of time, the 4-stroke cycle is able to happen. But as soon as that exhaust fills up, because we can't push anything out, then that exhaust is going to work its way back into the engine. Once that exhaust valve is open, we can't really push anything out, so we can't draw any fresh air, and then we can't do the 4-stroke cycle anymore. So you get out of that a kind of start stall. So it could be pointing towards an anti-theft. Now, we have other ways to determine, is this an anti-theft problem or not? Of course, that depends on the car, how obvious it's going to be, but usually there's something that's going to point towards, this car is immobilized, whether it's a light, it's a code, it's a data PID, or just the fact that, hey, the computer is shutting off the injectors shortly after this thing starts. And I am happy to have Automotive Seminars as a sponsor for the show. Now, if you're not familiar, Automotive Seminars is a diagnostic technician training company. They've got a website that there'll be a link to in the show notes. And what they offer is top-notch training to technicians like us in the field. I've been taking their training courses for years and have got a ton of benefit out of it. They've got top-notch instructors, John Thornton, Scott Shotton, Scott Manna, and every other month they've got a 2-night course that you can sign up for. Join in, ask questions, and afterwards, you've paid for the course, you can access a recorded version whenever you want. You can rewatch the class 2 years later in case you wanted some details on it. And that is a fantastic feature. So make sure to check out the website to see what courses they have available and what's coming up in the future. And in this case, you wouldn't have any of that, right? You're not going to have any immobilizer codes. You're not going to have any immobilizer light because it's not immobilized. And the injector pulse width is not going to stop, okay? Now, here's the other thing. And this was the case on the couple vehicles that I worked on over the last couple of weeks. I can't say this is 100% true across the board, but I would get that start stall immediately, or at least maybe in like the first couple attempts. And then after that, it basically became a crank no start, meaning that it is no longer starting. And this is, from what I can tell, the engine actually getting flooded out with fuel because we're not able to bring in any fresh oxygen. We're not able to have any combustion in that cylinder, and we're just adding more and more fuel as we go. And this can cause something else that I'll bring up that might be a sign that, hey, this is what we're dealing with. But that's the initial scenario getting into these where you might observe like, okay, this is like a crank start stall at first, and then it turns into just a a crank no start. And I don't have any, immobilizer codes or anything like that. Now, the other thing that I notice in this exact situation is if you're to take a spark plug out to inspect in the cylinder, number one, the spark plug is going to be wet with fuel, and you may even have a buildup of fuel in the cylinder. Now, this can lead to another thing that can be misleading, but it goes along with the symptoms that I've seen on these engines. And I've seen this multiple times in this scenario where a plugged up exhaust keeps it from starting, is you will have low compression on one or more cylinders, but maybe not all of them. And again, the reason is the fuel getting dumped into these cylinders as someone is attempting to start it, maybe it's you, maybe it's the person before you, actually washes down the cylinder walls to the point where it drops the compression on one or more cylinders. And again, I've seen this as a repeatable symptom of these exact scenarios, and it is a bit misleading, specifically with the Odyssey that we looked at, because it made it look like one whole bank was low on compression compared to the other. And while maybe that was true, that the actual compression wasn't the reason that the engine wasn't starting. It was a restricted exhaust, but the restricted exhaust causing the no start caused and extended cranking on this thing caused too much fuel to wash down the cylinders and drop the compression down. Now, anytime we're looking at a cylinder that has low compression, especially if you're looking at it like relative compression, which I would be doing here, you may want to add a little bit of oil if it's possible to that cylinder to see if it bumps the compression back up. And that's much easier said than done, especially if you're in the field doing it mobile. But, it's the difference between calling an engine and actually calling what is actually wrong with the vehicle. So something to think about there, but that's what I see happen. Now, the cylinders being flooded with fuel, the spark plug being wet with fuel, we could do our spark check and make sure that we're actually getting spark in that case. You should at least be able to say, yes, something is being sprayed into the cylinders. The correct fuel is going to be a possibility here. And I have seen scenarios where vehicles will exhibit the same symptoms, whether it be a crank start stall or just a crank no start, from improper or contaminated fuel. And so this is a good time that you may want to do a fuel sample to see, well, not only what the pressure is, but then also what's the quality of the fuel that's going in here, right? There are situations and ambient temperatures that could cause just something as simple as E85 being put in a vehicle that's not meant for it. Even an E85 vehicle that has the internal ECM's calculation for fuel delivery off, it thinks it's E85, but it's not, or vice versa, that could cause a no start. So you want to do a fuel quality sample, not only to look at, okay, is it actual gasoline? If it's a gasoline engine, that's what I'm talking about here. Is it E85 if it expects E85? Is it just regular, E10 pump gas if that's what it expects? You'll have to look at the vehicle that you're working on and how to determine, is it an E85 vehicle and what is it expecting right now per the PCM, right? What pulse width for the injectors is it actually running on the percentage of ethanol it thinks is in the fuel? That's an important thing to know. And then you need to be able to test to see how much ethanol is actually in the fuel. That's 100% in this situation, something that could and has caused this before, both contaminated and the incorrect fuel. But if you check the pressure and then you have like a graduated cylinder or even an empty Gatorade bottle, you can do a check of the fuel pretty easily at this point. And now, if you have quality fuel and the computer knows exactly the ethanol content of that fuel that's going in there, and that, hey, fuel is definitely getting into the cylinder because it's full of it, right? Now we can start looking at some other things here. Now, are there possibilities where it could just be spraying too much fuel based on a improper input, coolant temperature sensor, and there's other things that could cause this potentially, but a lot of those can be eliminated just by looking at data PIDs on like key on engine off, right? We can kind of do a rationality check of like, hey, do all my temperature sensors make sense for where the vehicle sits right now? And if it hasn't run in a while, they should all be pretty equal, right? Are all the pressure data PIDs reading the way that I would expect them to? Even a mass airflow sensor, a mass airflow sensor 100% can cause a crank start stall. You can look at, see what the data PID is there. You can unplug the mass airflow in a lot of cases and see. I will say, when I've seen a mass airflow have that happen, it usually doesn't flood out the engine, but I want to be careful there because there's so many cars out there and it could definitely potentially happen. But usually when I see the mass airflow cause that specific symptom, it's not adding enough fuel. And basically you're not going to have a flooded engine from a mass airflow most of the time. Again, mass airflows are a dynamic sensor, and they can fail in a lot of different ways. I think I have done podcasts about that, and I could do another one of mass airflows being probably the toughest sensor on the car to really assess, because it can fail at one point of its operation but not the other, and we have no actual realistic way of measuring how much air is really going into the engine. Like every other sensor on the car, we can make a measurement and see like what is the actual fuel pressure, what is the actual temperature. But for the mass airflow, that's much more difficult. Anyways, the whole different story. So it is something to consider if you have these symptoms. Now, the next thing, and you will need the tooling for this, is a big winner for me, and it has been for a number of these vehicles, except for one of them this past week, and I'll get to that. But on the Honda, it was the winner, is I went in cylinder at this point. Now, because of the way the compression looked on this Honda, we were suspecting that there could potentially be a timing issue. And it just so happened on this 02 Honda Odyssey with a 3.5 liter that it was on the back cylinder bank, which does not have a cam sensor, right? That's the other thing, is if you have a timing issue, you could definitely have some of these symptoms as well. I've had it where mechanical timing being off in an engine causes it to flood and create a no start at an ambient temperature where you shouldn't see an engine flooding. And So that's something I want to look for. But on this Honda, that back bank does not have a cam sensor, meaning we wouldn't have a code for it. Would it set a code cranking anyways? I don't know on an O2 Honda, maybe not, but it's not even monitored by the computer. It just has a cam sensor on that front bank on these older 3.5s. So the compression's low back there. We want to check it. I went in with a WPS to see what are the pressures actually look like. And now through a relative compression, we saw they were a little bit low, but I want to see, can I compare maybe valve opening and see, is there something very obvious wrong with the cylinders going on back here? And this is where I ended up finding that, oh no, it's not that it's a valve timing issue. It is the fact that we have almost 5 PSI of exhaust back pressure cranking. Okay, so we didn't even get the engine to start by the time I got to this point, but I'm looking at that where 0 is and where the exhaust plateau is. And if you've never looked at a in-cylinder compression waveform using the Pico and a WPS, take a look and you can see the 2 peaks on either side, and then the exhaust plateau will be in the middle. And what that's representing is as the piston is traveling up in the cylinder and the exhaust valve is open, you're going to see not only what the pressure in the cylinder is, but what the pressure in the exhaust manifold is, right? When the exhaust valve's open, you're basically what's happening in the exhaust manifold and what's happening in the cylinder is the same place, essentially. So if you have back pressure, you're going to see it there. And it had 5 PSI of back pressure cranking, okay? Now, this wasn't just on one side of the engine, this was on both. And it ended up on this Honda that it was a completely restricted exhaust. Now, why did this happen on this Honda? This was because it actually sat for a year and a rodent had gotten into the exhaust and packed it full of, it looked to be something like dog food. And I've actually seen that happen a couple times before. I had a Ford Focus much earlier in my career. I was working at Firestone at the time, and this one actually ran, but it was smoking like crazy. And again, it was pretty early on in my career, and I ended up saying, hey, there's something wrong like internal to the engine where it's burning a lot of oil. Because it's billowing smoke out of this exhaust, and I can't find, something obvious going into the cylinders, and I kind of think it smells like oil, but it's got a weird smell to it. I remember thinking that. Well, it was corn that had plugged up the exhaust enough so this one actually still ran, but it was causing the smoke to come out of the exhaust as it was running. And that one, I didn't do the final diagnostic on that. I think it ended up going back to the dealer and they found that, but I never forgot that one because I was like, oh, that smell. Yeah, that could have been burning corn. And anyways, rodents get into the exhaust and they can plug it up. And usually the vehicle's got to sit for a long period of time, like over a winter for that to happen. But it can 100% happen if it's in place where a rodent can climb up into the tailpipe and make a stockpile of food. And maybe you got a bag of corn or dog food in the garage. And it makes sense that it can happen. Okay, so that was the Honda. And the WPS did it for me to see 5 PSI of back pressure while cranking. Now, could you also potentially look at your manifold pressure at the same time here and see that we're not going into any sort of a vacuum while cranking? That's definitely a possibility too, is to see that, hey, we're not pulling anything. Now, we're not supposed to pull a real deep vacuum just while cranking, but there should be something. The engine should be pulling something. And if you can get it to start and watch your intake manifold pressure, that's another thing. And I actually was able to do this on a Ford, I think it was a Mustang years ago that had this problem. And I remember looking at the map sensor on this particular Ford, and I could see that it was barely leaving atmospheric pressure. And this thing would actually it would kind of start and run. It would briefly just chug a little bit and it would stall, but it barely leaves atmospheric pressure inside of the manifold. And you could use a vacuum gauge. You could look at the map sensor on it and see that. And that's a sign pointing towards like, hey, we're not able to pull a vacuum on this engine. Of course, there's other things that can cause that, but one of them is we can't push any air out, so we're not going to be able to draw any fresh air in. So that's one, reason that could happen. Now, you have a vehicle like this '07 Mustang with like a 4.0, you could disconnect the EGR tube and that would allow it to start. Now, a lot of vehicles, you don't have that option, but if you do, connecting the tube or whatever the connection is to an EGR, that might be more realistic than pulling an O2 sensor. So keep that in mind. You might have that on some vehicles and be able to do that. So the other one that we did this week was a Chevy Silverado with a 5.3. And this again was also crank no start cylinders. The shop had been up and down on this one and they really weren't sure where they were going with it. And on this one, again, this is the same week as the Honda. And I was able to at least think about it as a possibility, but I went for the WPS, this Chevy as well, and 5.3, putting it in there. And I did not have what I would consider excessive back pressure in the exhaust while cranking on this one. Now, what I probably should have done is put it in right away before I did anything, because this engine, again, did start briefly and then it stalled out. And then it was just really just a crank for me after that. Maybe I would have seen some more back pressure when the engine actually started. So it's kind of my tip here is like, it's a hard one to really push. Like, is that the first thing you're going to do on no start, is throw the WPS in? Maybe, but I could see a whole lot of arguments why like that should not be your first test. So I don't know that I can really make that argument, but it would have shown it to me in this case. So hindsight says that's what you should have done and probably would have caught it a little bit quicker. Again, looking at manifold pressure, I wasn't looking at it close enough on this one to really use that as my direction, but I did go through just about everything else on this truck and say, hey, I really do feel like we got to pull this O2 out of here and see, because I've done everything else and it's a 5.3 and I work on these things all the time. And I'm like, these are not that complicated. It's air, fuel, spark, and I've been through everything, right? Checking the fuel, looking at the fuel quality, making sure I have injector pulse. I've got spark. I did the relative compression, and this did have a couple low cylinders. They were wet with fuel, but again, getting good spark there. And so I told the guy, I was like, hey, can we just yank one of these O2s? I was like, pick either side. It doesn't matter because it's a Y pipe on this one. So you have two upstream converters that go back into a single one. And so like really you could pull any of these O2 sensors. I'd prefer it's an upstream, but just pull any of them and let's see if it changes our situation, because it's not even trying to start after that initial one. So my guess is it has to be the most downstream converter that's plugged up, would be my guess. And so he ended up pulling the O2 sensor out and it fired right up almost immediately at this point. And so we know, okay, that's what we've got going on. Now, to be totally honest, I don't know that I really would have pushed for that had I not just had the Honda earlier in the week. I might have gone through with some other tests. Again, because that back pressure one, it wasn't conclusive for me when I was looking at the WPS with it cranking. And I guess that's what I'm talking about on the show here too, is like you can't always rely on the same test method to give you the answer on every single car. That was the case in this one. And I don't know if it's because it's a V8, because it's got that big Y pipe. Maybe I should have let it crank longer and maybe I would have seen the back pressure on that exhaust plateau. But just cranking it, I didn't see anything that really stood out as a problem. But the WPS does give you a lot of other good information, like, hey, all my valves are moving in the correct way that I expect them to. I have good compression on this cylinder. You can use it to compare like where the spark timing is happening within the rotation and the 4-stroke cycle. That's useful information for something like this. There is on those Silverados, there's something where the phaser pin can stick and it'll cause it to kind of be out of time, and that can cause a no start. But usually you have a compression issue or you have some valve, the valve timing is going to be off because the phaser is stuck in the wrong position. And I didn't have that. Everything looked like it was supposed to. So I want to move me along to, hey, let's pull this O2 out and see what happens. And that ended up being the case on this vehicle as well. So Anyways, that's where I'm going to wrap this one up. I thought it was an interesting thing to talk about. And I don't know, maybe you guys run into this out there more often than I do, but I don't see it that often. And I thought it was worth talking about on the show. So thank you to everybody out there for listening. I always appreciate it. And I always appreciate chatting with people. If you shoot me a message on Facebook or an email, I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. Other than that, let's get out there, start fixing the world one car at a time.